Dry Wells, Arizona Territory, August 1885. The rope cut deep into Winona Ashworth's wrists as Silas Crane dragged her through the burning street. Reservation bounty, Crane shouted, waving the paper. This girl belongs to the law now. Winona lifted her bruised chin, eyes blazing. No, I belong to no man. A scar-knuckled rider laughed. Hear that? The little half-breed thinks she has got a voice. Then a calm voice came from the shadows between two stores. You gonna stand there and watch a woman get sold like a mule? Every gun hand froze. Crane turned. This doesn't concern you, old man. Caleb Ashworth stepped into the sunlight, his face cold as iron. When you put a rope on my daughter, he said, you made it concern me. And before Dry Wells could breathe again, the street exploded. Stay with this story until the end, because what Winona wrote on one scrap of paper would bring down men who thought the law belonged to them. Dry Wells, Arizona Territory, August 1885. The sun hit the main street like a punishment. Winona Ashworth kept her eyes down and her feet moving. Rope bit into her wrists. The knot was tight enough to bruise, but loose enough to let her fingers work. She had been counting on that since they pulled her off her horse 2 miles out of town. She had 4 words left to write. The scrap of paper was folded inside her left palm, small, barely 3 inches across. She had torn it from the back cover of a dime novel during the night, in the dark, by feel alone. The pencil stub was wedged between her ring finger and her pinky, angled so it would look, at a glance, like her hands were simply curled. She wrote without looking down. She had practiced this. Dot and their names are known. Done. She curled the paper tighter and pressed it against the inside of her wrist, under the rope. It would leave a mark. Fine, everything left a mark. In her left boot, she could feel the edge of her mother's obsidian shard pressing against her ankle. She had kept it there since she was 16. Sharp end wrapped in leather. A last measure if things ran out of options. She was hoping it wouldn't come to that. Silas Crane rode ahead of her. He sat his horse like a man who had never once been told no, which was probably true. He was big, graying at the temples, with the kind of patience that should have been a virtue, and wasn't. Behind her, 2 of his riders walked their horses slow, keeping pace. 3 more fanned out on the sides. 5 men, 6 with Crane. The street was not empty. That was the thing about Dry Wells, it never was. A man stood outside the barber shop. A woman pulled her child back from the edge of the steps. A boy of maybe 12 sat on a water barrel eating an apple. Watching like this was something that happened on a Tuesday. Sometimes it did. Nobody said a word. Winona had grown up watching people decide that silence was the same thing as safety. It wasn't. It just felt that way until it was too late. One of Crane's men, the one with the scarred knuckles, the one who had yanked her off her horse, leaned down from his saddle and said something low to the rider beside him. She caught the tail end of it. Captain wants this one quiet. She filed that away, Captain. A military word. And nobody in Crane's operation looked like they'd touched a uniform in 10 years. She pressed the paper tighter against her wrist. That was the thing about Crane's business. It had paperwork. It had a legal name, Reservation Bounty Recovery. They called it, and some judges called it, lawful, because some judges called whatever paid them lawful, stripped of the words, though it was a sale. He was going to sell her. He had a buyer already, a man with a ledger and a locked wagon. No interest in reservation paperwork at all. Just the money to be made, moving a young woman who had no one looking for her. He was wrong about that last part. At the end of the street, the door to Joe Freeman's inn stood open. Joe herself was in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw set hard. A stout woman, maybe 50, with gray threaded through her hair. Her face was memorizing everything. She caught Winona's eye for 1 second and held it. Joe knew. She had known before they even rode in. Winona gave the smallest nod she could manage. Joe's chin dipped once in return. I see you. I'm not going anywhere. Crane pulled his horse up near the center of the street and held up a folded document. More for the audience. than for any legal reason. Reservation bounty, he announced. To no one and everyone. Girl's got half-blood papers filed under her mother's band. That makes her subject to federal recovery under the Indian Relocation Act. And any interference with this lawful process constitutes. You're going to stand there and watch a person get sold like a mule. The voice came from the side of the street. Quiet, unhurried. It didn't need to be loud to carry. Winona turned her head. The man standing in the gap between the feed store and the tailor's shop was lean, maybe 50, with dust on his coat and a hat pulled low. No badge, no star. His hands were loose at his sides. Either nothing or everything, depending on who you were. She knew who he was. She had known since the first mile out of town that he would come. She had counted on it the same way. She had counted on the rope being slightly loose. There were two things in this world she had never once doubted. Ink outlasted iron, and her father always showed up. Crane turned his horse. This doesn't concern you. Friend, I'm not your friend, Caleb Ashworth said. The street changed. You could feel it before it happened. That shift in the air that comes a second before a storm breaks. The man outside the barber shop stepped back inside. The woman on the steps was gone. Even the boy with the apple had disappeared. The 5 riders reached for their guns. Caleb was already moving. The shooting lasted maybe 12 seconds. It felt longer. 2 of Crane's men were down before Winona hit the dirt, pulling her bound wrists under her knees and getting her hands in front of her body, which she had also practiced. When it stopped, Crane was still in the saddle, barely, blood spreading dark through his shirt, just below the shoulder. He looked at Caleb with a cold, almost respectful hatred. You just bought yourself a war, he said. You started it, Caleb said. When you put a rope on my daughter, Crane wheeled his horse and rode. The 2 riders who could still ride went with him. Jo was already out the door, walking fast, her face a mask and her hands ready. Winona got to her feet. The paper was still pressed under the rope at her wrist, still dry, still whole. She had 4 words that needed mailing. She started toward the inn. The rope had cut deepest on the left wrist. Caleb could see where the skin had gone raw at the pressure points. She'd been angling her hand inward the whole time, keeping her fingers moving without moving the rope. He'd trained her to do exactly that, to find the space inside a bad situation and use it. He was glad it had worked, and he hated that he'd needed to teach it to her. He worked the salve in slow circles. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried sage, and the salt pork Jo had going on the stove. You could have told me about the letters, he said. You would have told me to stop. I would have told you to do it more carefully. I was careful, Winona said. I got caught, and I still finished the letter. He didn't argue with that. He picked up the linen strip and started wrapping. Jo came in from the porch, wrung the bloody rag out in the sink, and stood in the kitchen doorway, long enough to look at Winona's wrists, Caleb's face, and the barred door. She'd already sent her 2 boarders out the back, with a week's refund and a look that communicated everything they needed to know about leaving quickly. She'd shuttered the windows without being asked. Jo Freeman moved through crises the way she moved through everything, quick and precise and without announcement. There's a rider on his way to Crane's camp right now, she said. I know, Caleb said. That's a fact, not a guess. Someone in this town always does. I know that too. Then, what are you planning to do about it? Right now, I'm wrapping my daughter's wrist. Jo gave him a long look. She went to the stove. Winona watched his hands, steady as ever. They'd been steady this afternoon with 6 men and a half second to make a decision, and they were steady now doing something as ordinary as tying linen. She used to think that quality was something men like her father were given at birth. She'd revised that. Steadiness like his was constructed, layer by layer, out of years of needing to hold still when the body wanted to do anything but. Papa, she said. My grandmother. His hands stopped. One breath, then he started moving again. What about her? He said. It was not entirely a question. Is she dead? Outside, a horse moved past on the street. Slow steps. Then, quiet. The fire settled in the grate. She might still be breathing, Caleb said. Winona waited. I've never had the nerve to go find out. She looked at his face. He was looking at her wrist with the careful, fixed attention of a man who was looking everywhere except where he meant to look. How long, she said. Letters stopped around 77. He tied off the linen. Neat and even. Could have meant a lot of things. I spent a long time telling myself it meant different things. San Carlos. That's my guess. You're afraid of what she'll say to you. He looked up. His eyes were dark and steady and tired, in the specific way that years produce, not today's tired, but the accumulated kind. Yes, he said. Plain and clean. No padding on it. Winona let it stand. Joe set bowls on the table. Salt pork and beans, which was what Joe made when there was no time to decide what to make. Caleb ate. Winona ate. Joe sat across from them with her coffee and watched the room. Your mother was one of the strongest women I ever met, Joe said. And I have met some women. She never described herself that way, Winona said. Strong people don't describe themselves, Joe said. Somebody else does it for them. Their job is just to keep doing what needs doing. Caleb ate. He was somewhere else in his head. That was one of his habits, being physically present and mentally about 4 miles away simultaneously. Winona's mind went somewhere too. A morning east of the Dragoons. Flat open ground. She'd been maybe 12. Her father had set up a row of bottles on a fence rail, handed her the small .22, and stepped back. No speech, no instructions, just the space to do it. She'd been too slow on the first bottle, too fast on the second. The third she'd hit clean, and the sound traveled up through her collarbone into her jaw, bright and final. Her mother's voice. From somewhere behind both of them. She shoots better than you did at that age. And her father, without turning his head. She shoots better than me now. Willow's laugh. That even. Unhurried laugh that meant she'd already known and wasn't surprised. Winona set her spoon down. Joe, she said, the press contacts. Tell me. Joe reached into her apron and put a folded piece of paper on the table. Man in Boston named Raymond Alcott. He runs a paper called The Liberty Standard. It started as an abolitionist sheet in the early 1850s. After the war, he broadened the scope human rights. He calls it now. Freedmen, immigrant workers, indigenous peoples swept up under the removal laws. Same moral foundation, wider range. She tapped the paper. That's his address. Winona unfolded it. Joe's handwriting was small and precise, the kind you develop when you learn to write in secret and understand from the start that putting a letter on paper is already an act with a cost. He'll print what I send him. He'll print it if it's built right. There's a difference between a complaint and a case. Joe spread her hands flat on the table. A complaint says this happened to me. A case says this is a system. Here are the names of the people running it. Here are the specific dates. Here is corroborating evidence. A complaint makes a reader angry. A case makes an editor brave. Crane's name is in what I've written. Is it tied to a specific date and location? Something a second person could verify independently. Winona thought through what she had. The May delivery in Bisbee. I was at the depot. I can describe the contractor, the wagon, the 2 men with him. I can describe the brand on the leather tackle. Then you write. On May 3rd, 1885, at the stage depot in Bisbee, Arizona Territory, I observed. Month, day, year, fully written out. First person, then exactly what your eyes saw. Joe paused. A reader can question a conclusion. They have to work harder to question a Thursday. What if I want to draw the conclusion directly? You can in its own paragraph, after you've shown the evidence, but earn it first. Put what you saw, what you heard, what you can prove. Then draw your line. If you draw the line before you've earned it, you're just a person with opinions. If you draw it after, you're a witness. Joe stood up, went to the writing desk in the corner, and came back with fresh paper, a real pen, and a small glass inkwell. She set them in front of Winona. After you eat, she said. Caleb looked at the pen. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Joe. She's 19, he said. Quietly. Yes, Joe said. She could be killed for sending that. Joe sat down and folded her hands. She could be killed for not sending it. The difference is what kind of life she lives in between. You've been watching people go quiet to stay safe your whole career, Caleb. How many of them are safe? He was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his bowl, took it to the sink, walked to the chair by the front door, and sat down. He crossed his arms and pulled his hat low and looked at the door. It was his way of saying yes when he couldn't make himself say it out loud. Winona had known that about him for years. She picked up the pen. Joe pulled her chair close. And they started from the beginning, not from ideology, from structure. She explained why a sentence that opened with a name carried more authority than one that opened with an action. She talked about the specificity of date, month and day and year, not in May or last spring, because approximation invited dismissal. She talked about evidence versus opinion, how to label the difference clearly in the text itself so an editor could point to it and say, "This is documented." My grandmother used to say a rumor has legs, but a document has roots. Joe said, once it's in print, it's planted. A man can run down a rumor and kill it. He cannot dig up every copy of a newspaper. Around 9 o'clock, Caleb slipped out the back without explanation. He was gone about 20 minutes. When he came back, his left sleeve was rolled to the elbow, and there was dark on it, already dried in the desert air. He sat back down and said nothing. Joe looked at the sleeve. "The ones who couldn't ride," she said. A statement, not a question. Moved south of the livery. Gulch. Town'll deal with it or won't. Then 3 taps at the back door. A pause, 2 more. Joe stood immediately and went to answer it. A woman came in, 50s, plainly dressed, with the face of someone who had spent most of her life being invisible on purpose. She looked at each of them and spoke fast. "Tom Pruitt's boy left the saloon riding east about an hour ago. He does jobs for Crane. I counted horses when they brought her and 6 came. 4 left on their own legs," Joe said. "Thank you." The woman looked at Winona for a moment. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she went back out, and Joe barred the door. Caleb said, "You've got a network in this town." "I've had a network in this town for 11 years. Joe sat back down. "Mostly women who watch things through windows and have never once been asked what they saw. They see everything." She picked up the paper. "The mistake men like Crane always make. They think quiet means empty." They went back to the letter. Later, past midnight, Winona asked the question she'd been sitting with. "Why did you stay here?" Joe. "After everything this town has done and let happen, you had contacts back east. You could have left." Joe was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire, which had burned down to orange coals. "Because someone has to stay," she said. "The people who leave, they've earned it, maybe. But if everyone who sees clearly walks away, then the place you left behind only ever belongs to the people who were making it bad." She turned the last page of the draft. "I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to let this place belong to them just because they wanted it to." She set the page down. "Besides," she said, "the food in Boston is not near as good." Winona laughed, quietly, so as not to wake Caleb. Joe's mouth pulled at one corner. By 1 in the morning, the letter was close. 3 pages, dense with specific detail. Crane's name 6 times. Dates verified against what Winona could prove. Observations separated from conclusions. Evidence first, judgment after. Joe read the last page and said, "One more line after your signature." "Right. Further testimony available upon request, with supporting witnesses." "Do I have supporting witnesses?" "You have me. You have your father. You have the woman who just left this kitchen. You have 3 people in Bisbee who know what that May delivery was." Joe closed the draft. "You don't need them lined up at the door tonight. You just need to be honest that you're not the only one." Winona wrote the line. Caleb had fallen asleep in his chair, hat tipped forward, arms crossed, feet flat. He looked like a man who had put down a heavy thing and had not yet decided if he'd pick it back up. Joe blew out her lamp. Winona sat in the near dark and looked at the 3 pages. 2 years of watching and noting and rewriting, folded into a sealed envelope that would go east on Thursday's stage. The names were in it. The dates were in it. The truth was in it. Built the way Joe had taught her, measured and specific and impossible to wave away. She took it to bed, put it under her pillow. Sleep came before she'd thought to go looking for it. 3 days passed without Crane. Winona didn't trust it. Crane wasn't the kind of man who quit. He was the kind who went away and came back with a better plan and more men. The 3 days were preparation, not retreat. She understood that and used her own 3 days accordingly. The first day, she went through the letter again, checking every specific claim against every specific memory she could access. The Bisbee date, the description of the wagon, the contractor's name, which she'd gotten off his own bill of sale when he'd left it on a table and stepped outside. Names of 2 more men in the operation she could identify by face and, in one case, by a distinctive tattoo. The second day, she made a clean copy. No crossed-out lines, no margin notes. Joe had told her a letter that looked careless, invited the reader to treat its contents carelessly. So Winona copied it out in her best handwriting on fresh paper, every sentence in the right order, every date fully written out. On the 3rd morning, she came downstairs with the envelope sealed and her coat on. Joe looked at it on the table. "Today," she said. "Stage goes east at noon. Thursday mail." Winona put the envelope in her coat pocket. Joe nodded. Caleb looked up from his coffee. "I'll walk with you," he said. "No, Winona, if you walk me to the stage depot," she said. "It looks like the letter needs a gun standing next to it. I need it to look like a young woman going to mail something on a Thursday morning, because that's all it is." She watched him think through it. He set his coffee down. He went to the window and looked at the street for a moment. Then he stepped to the side. That was Caleb Ashworth conceding a point. You had to know to look for it. She walked alone. 3 blocks. The morning air still carried the cool of the night, though that wouldn't last another hour. The street was going about its business, a man sweeping the hardware store steps. Horses at the rails. The sound of hammering coming from somewhere past the livery where a new building was going up. The smell of bread from somewhere south. She counted every open door and every unfamiliar face and every horse she couldn't account for. And she did it so naturally it barely felt like doing it. Inside the stage depot, Hector sat behind his counter, looking like a man who had personally decided that having an opinion about anything was too much work. He'd been behind that counter since before the war. He would probably be behind it long after. Winona put the envelope on the counter. "Boston. First class. 12 cents, Hector said. She paid him. He stamped it and set it in the eastbound bin behind him, between a land survey notice and what looked like a grocery order being forwarded to a relative. She stood there a moment. 12 cents. 2 years of watching and noting and rewriting. Now sitting in a sorting bin next to somebody's grocery list. She didn't know what she had expected the moment to feel like. Larger, maybe. Instead, it was just a quiet Tuesday morning inside a plain room that smelled like ink and wood dust. And the letter was in the bin. And it was done. She walked back to the inn. The street was exactly as she'd left it. The bread still smelled good. She went inside. "Done," she said. Joe put a plate in front of her. The deputy arrived around noon. He came from the North Tucson, which meant the county office had gotten wind of the shooting before the day was out. He was younger than Winona had pictured when she'd been thinking about who might show up. Mid-20s, lean-faced, with the careful economy of movement that comes from a man who has found that being underestimated is sometimes worth preserving. He had his star on his chest and his gun on his hip. He knocked on Joe's door instead of pushing it open. Joe looked at him for 3 full seconds. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." His name was Tobias Wren, Pima County Sheriff's Office, and he sat down across the table from Caleb and opened a notebook and asked his questions without warm-up or indirection. What happened? How many men? Who initiated? What was the stated reason for Crane's presence? What was the outcome? Caleb answered each question in order. Crane had come with 6 men. His daughter had been taken on fraudulent reservation bounty paperwork with the intent to sell. He'd intervened. Crane's men had gone for their guns first. 2 were dead and 1 injured. Crane and the rest had withdrawn. Tobias wrote it all down. His handwriting was quick and self-taught, the handwriting of a person who had figured it out for themselves rather than being drilled in it. He asked about the paperwork specifically. Had Caleb read it? What authority did it cite? Had anyone else seen it? He asked whether the woman who had come to the back door that night would speak to a county deputy, which told Winona he had already been doing more talking to people in town than it looked like. He was thorough. He wasn't hostile. He asked Joe 3 questions about her own role as a witness and wrote her answers down with the same care he'd given Caleb's. Then his eyes moved to the table. Winona's working draft was there, the crossed-out version, the one with margin notes in 3 different colors of ink, the one she hadn't moved from the table in 3 days. She saw the exact moment it registered with him. His pencil hand went still. He looked at her. "May I?" he said. She nodded. He picked it up and read it. Not the way you skim something. The way you read something you want to understand before you decide anything about it. Line by line, going back sometimes. Pressing his thumb against a paragraph while he read the one after it, connecting the pieces the way a careful person would. He read the names. He read May 3rd in Bisbee. He read the description of the wagon and the contractor and the men. He read the paragraph about what the federal bounty papers actually said versus what the law they cited actually authorized. He set it down. He looked out the window. The window showed a perfectly ordinary piece of dry wells. False front buildings. Horses. A slice of white sky above the roofline. He wasn't looking at any of it. Tobias Wren was 14 years old in 1874, and he was standing in an alley behind Rafferty's General Store in a small town in New Mexico Territory on a September afternoon, pressing his back against the wall, listening to a wagon go by. He'd been in that alley to avoid chores and the truant officer, both of which were abundant. He heard the wagon before he saw it. Something in the sound was wrong, too heavy, too slow, and under the axle creak, there was another sound he couldn't place. He'd looked around the corner. A covered wagon with metal brackets on the sides and a padlocked gate at the back. 4 men, all armed, moving south, slow and deliberate, through the slats of the gate. A woman's face, brown-skinned, dark-eyed, maybe 30. She was pressed close to the gate, her eyes sweeping the street, looking for anyone. They found Tobias. 1 second, too, her eyes on his on hers. Then the wagon moved past. He pressed his back against the building. He stayed there until the sound of the wheels was gone. His palms were flat on the wall. He dug his nails into the wood without noticing. He could have found his father. He could have found the town marshal. He could have followed the wagon and come back with information. He had stood against that wall until the sound was nothing. He was too young, he'd told himself. There was nothing he could have done. He'd been telling himself that for 11 years, and the story was getting harder to believe. He looked back at the draft on the table. "Who else knows about the Bisbee delivery?" he said. 3 people I can name, Winona said. Possibly more who don't want to say so. Would they speak to a county deputy? That depends on whether the deputy is working for the county or working for Crane. He looked at her, clean and level. No flinching. "Fair," he said. "I want to be straight with you. I've taken 3 side contracts from Crane's network in the past 2 years. None of them were the trafficking operations I didn't know, or I told myself I didn't know, but they were tied to his business, and I was paid for them. So your question is reasonable." The kitchen was quiet. 1 contract, he continued, was a livestock recovery, outside Wilcox, last spring. He paused. I think now there was no livestock. Joe had put her coffee down. Caleb said, "What'll you do with your report? Write it up and file it with the sheriff." "That's procedure." He looked at the draft. "But what's on that paper that's not a county report?" "That's testimony going somewhere a county report doesn't go. It's already gone," Winona said. He looked at her. "Boston," she said. "I mailed it this morning. It's in the Thursday bin." Something moved across his face. Quick and internal. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching specifically for it. "The human rights papers," he said. "The Liberty Standard." He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his notebook and his pencil and stood. He put his hat on and looked at Caleb. "Take me to the gulch when you're ready." Caleb stood. Tobias moved toward the door. He passed behind Winona's chair. He slowed there, not much. Just enough, and his eyes went to the draft on the table. 1 more time. He didn't say anything, But the look on his face was not the look of a deputy looking at evidence. It was the look of a person looking at something that had named a thing he'd been carrying without a name for 11 years. He walked out. 20 yards up the street, he stopped. He stood in the midday heat with his hat in his hand. He was looking south. He knew where south went. He had always known where south went. He put his hat back on. He kept walking north. But something had broken open inside him. Some room he had built and locked and plastered over. It had light in it now, and Tobias Wren was going to have to decide, eventually, what to do with the light. He wasn't sure yet. He wasn't sure of much right now. He kept walking. Tobias Wren came back 4 days later. He said it was follow-up on the incident report. He needed to clarify a few details about the sequence of events, the position of Crane's men relative to the inn, that kind of thing. Caleb answered his questions. Tobias wrote them down. Then he stood in the kitchen for the better part of 10 minutes, looking at the closed door to the back room where Winona was working on something with Joe. Joe came out and offered coffee. Tobias said yes. He left an hour and a half later without having clarified anything of consequence. He came back 5 days after that. This time he brought a small jar of willow bark preparation for Joe's hands, which he'd noticed were cracked and raw from the cleaning she'd done after the shooting. He held it out when she opened the door and said he'd gotten it from the apothecary and thought it might help. Joe looked at the jar. She looked at him. "Come in," she said. He had coffee and sat at the table and talked about road conditions and a land dispute he was working on in the eastern county and the odds of a second washout on the Tucson Road before September was over. He was a decent conversationalist, not showy about it, just comfortable talking. Easy to be with in a way that some people were and some people weren't. Winona sat across from him and let him talk himself down from the road conditions. She waited. He stopped talking about the Tucson Road and said, "The letter. Have you heard back?" "It's been 9 days," she said. "Mail takes 2 weeks to Boston. 2 weeks back. I won't hear anything for another month." "If they print it," he said. "When?" He looked at her. "I'm very certain about what I wrote," she said. "Whether Raymond Alcott runs it is his decision, but I believe he will, because there are names in it with specific dates attached to them, and nobody has put them on paper before. And that kind of material is what papers like his exist to run." Tobias turned his cup. "What made you start writing it all down?" Winona considered the question. "My mother died in 1879, she said. After she was gone, my father became very good at not being in one place too long, and I had a lot of time by myself to think. I started writing because I thought if I put the specific, verifiable truth on paper, someone with the power to act on it would act on it. That's a lot of faith in paper. Joe says a document has roots. A rumor has legs but can be run down. A printed document, once it's out, is in the ground." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that naive? Believing the truth will be enough." "I don't know yet," Winona said. "I'll tell you when I find out." He looked at her like he was deciding something. Then he looked at the table. "I'm filing an amended report with the county sheriff," he said. "I'm naming 3 of Crane's known associates and flagging the May delivery as requiring formal investigation." He paused. "The sheriff is cautious. It won't move fast, but it'll be on record." "Thank you," Winona said. He nodded and picked up his hat. Caleb was reading a newspaper at the far end of the table, which he had already read twice. He turned a page without looking up. Tobias glanced at him. Caleb's expression said nothing. Tobias left. He came back a third time 6 days after that. He didn't bring anything. He didn't have a prepared reason. He just knocked, and when Joe let him in, he sat down and said, "I drove out to Wilcox yesterday for the report," Winona said. "To find the man I did the livestock recovery for last spring." He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table. "I wanted to know what I actually did." She set her pen down. "And there was no livestock. There was a family, a woman, and her 2 children taken from a camp just outside the reservation boundary. They'd been classified on paperwork as escaped wards. The paperwork had a seal on it from one of Crane's partners." He was quiet for a moment. "I tracked the direction they'd gone. I thought I was tracking stolen horses. The kitchen was still. I know, he said. Like she'd said the thing she was thinking without saying it. Did you find them? The children are at the reservation. The woman, he stopped. I'm still looking. Winona looked at his face. He wasn't performing guilt. He was just carrying it the way a person carries something they picked up and then realized they couldn't put down. You're not going to stop looking, she said. No, he said. She picked up her pen. He sat there, and after a few minutes, Joe came in from the back and surveyed the situation with one quick look and shoved a knife and a pile of carrots across the table at him, asking something about field medicine that she already knew he could answer. And by the time he'd worked out what happened, he was explaining sutures and cutting carrots, and his hands moved in the same careful, unhurried way as when he took his notes. Joe looked at the carrots and said, "Clean technique for a self-taught man. I read what I could find," he said. Field medicine pamphlets were easier to get than most books where I grew up. Joe extracted his entire medical education from him over the next 20 minutes. Without him noticing, she'd done it. When she was done, she put the carrots in the pot and said nothing, which was how Joe communicated approval. Crane rode back into Drywell's on Saturday afternoon. Winona saw them from the second-floor window where she'd been reading. 4 men with Crane, fewer than she'd expected. He rode with his left shoulder stiff under his coat. The wound had settled into the joint, and it was going to give him trouble for months. She noted that. A man moving through significant pain, who chooses to ride anyway, is telling you something about his state of mind. But the man beside him was the thing that held her attention. He was not a gun hand. That was plain from the first look. His coat was good city good, the kind of tailored wool that cost what a deputy made in 2 months. His hat was clean and properly blocked. He sat his horse like someone who rode occasionally and well, rather than constantly and hard. He had the particular alertness of a man who was used to gathering information about a place quickly and storing it for later use. Maybe 55. Gray at the temples. His face was weathered, but composed, not battered. Composed. There was a difference. Battered was what time and hard luck did to a person. Composed was a choice, made and maintained. He rode beside Crane and said something in a low voice. Crane nodded. The stranger's eyes moved across the street with the easy sweep of a man taking inventory. Then his eyes went to the inn's front porch. Caleb was there, coming out the front door, knocking mud off his boots against the step, an afternoon habit he'd carried for 30 years that Winona had never once seen him vary. He wasn't looking at the street. He was looking at his boot. The stranger saw him. No visible reaction. No pause, no change in posture. His eyes moved on across the street, as if Caleb were just another man with muddy boots. But Winona had been taught to watch faces. She had been watching faces her entire life. And she had seen the half-second the stranger's eyes went flat before they moved on. Not surprised, that was the wrong word. More like confirmed, the way a man looks when something he suspected turns out to be true. She stepped back from the window. She went downstairs, through the kitchen, to the back porch, where Caleb had come around to clean the other boot. "The man riding with Crane," she said. "The one in the good coat. Look from the upstairs window. Right side, away from the light." Caleb looked at her face. He went upstairs without asking why. He was back in 3 minutes. He poured himself a cup of coffee, which he did not drink. He looked at the cup on the counter. "You know him," Winona said. "I might." Who might he be? Caleb was quiet for long enough that she stopped waiting and simply watched him think. "There was a captain," he said finally, "in my unit. Before the massacre, he gave the order that walked us into it. He wrote the report that named me as responsible." He set the cup down. "I was told he'd gone back east. The massacre you were blamed for." "Yes." She thought about this. "And he's here with Crane." "Looks that way. Is that a coincidence?" He looked at her directly. "I stopped believing in coincidence in 1878. Joe came in from the front room. She had been doing the books at the front desk and had the pencil still in her hand. She looked at both of them. "What happened?" she said. "Crane's back," Winona said, "with a man my father recognizes." Joe looked at Caleb. Former Army, Caleb said. Byron Hale. Captain. Retired. A pause. If that's him. If, Joe said. Caleb said nothing. Out on the main street, the man who had ridden in as a railroad investor named Cole Barton had stopped his horse in front of the hotel. He was talking to Crane in the even, measured way of a man laying out a plan. Crane was listening with the attention of someone who usually made the plans himself and had decided, for now, that deferring was the better move. Byron Hale, because that was who he was. Cole Barton was a card in a coat pocket, and nothing more looked at the hotel sign. He looked at the street. He looked at the inn across from where they'd stopped. Caleb Ashworth was alive. He had been careful. After the massacre, he had filed the right reports, written the right letters, accepted the right commendations for his decisive handling of a difficult situation. He had retired decorously and moved himself 3 states away and built a version of himself that bore almost no resemblance to the man who had ordered a cavalry unit into an ambush and then written the survivor's name into the blame. He had a house in Denver. He had acquaintances who respected him. He had a name that meant something in certain rooms. And the man he'd buried under 14 years of paperwork was standing on a porch cleaning his boots. Hale had come because of the letter. Word of it had reached him some specific detail in what people were saying. The mention of Crane's network and named associates and dates. And he'd understood that someone with detailed knowledge was putting things on paper. He'd come to find out what was on the paper, and who had written it, and to handle Crane, who had been asking questions lately about his dead brother's unit and the commanding officer, and whose patience with convenient non-answers was running thin. 2 problems converging in the same small town. He'd solved more complex situations than this. He turned his horse toward the hotel and told Crane he'd want a meeting that evening to talk about the next steps in the operation. Crane agreed. Hale said he'd need a few days first to take the measure of the town. Talk to some people. Understand the lay of things. Crane agreed to that too. Hale went inside. He sat in the hotel room and looked out the window at the street for a while. He was a patient man when patience was required. He had learned a long time ago that speed was the enemy of clean outcomes. You looked first. You mapped the thing. You understood what each piece was doing. Then you moved. He needed to know what was in that letter. He needed to know exactly how close Crane was to understanding what had actually happened to his brother's unit. And he needed to remove Caleb Ashworth from the situation in a way that left no threads for anyone to pull. He'd built clean records before. He was meticulous, and he was practiced, and he was, as far as Denver knew, a respectable man with a good name. He had not gotten this far by being careless. He picked up a piece of the hotel's writing paper and a pen. He began composing a letter of his own to a man in Tucson who owed him a favor and had access to certain county records. He wrote it in the careful, specific, unhurried language of a man who understood that words on paper were the most durable tools a person could carry. He wrote, "The afternoon light moved across the wall. Outside, Dry Wells went on being a quiet town. It was not going to stay quiet long, but Byron Hale had always worked best in the quiet. The copy of the Liberty Standard arrived on a Tuesday. Folded between 2 books in a package Joe had ordered from a Cincinnati press. It had been sitting at the stage depot for 6 days because Hector wasn't in the habit of sending word when freight arrived. Joe had known that and sent Winona to check. Winona was 3 steps back from the depot door when she saw the corner of the broad sheet sticking out between the bindings. She stopped in the middle of the street. She pulled it free and turned to page 2. Because Joe had told her months ago that page 2 was where Raymond Alcott put the work he believed in. Front page was what sold papers. Page 2 was what he printed when he was angry. The Liberty Standard Vol. No. 31 trafficking ring operates under federal cover in Arizona territory, a correspondence testimony with names and dates. And under that, in the byline column, W. Ashworth, Dry Wells, A.T. She read it, standing in the street. She read every line, including the 2 editorial paragraphs Alcott had added at the end. calling for a congressional inquiry in language that was calm and precise and absolutely merciless. He'd tightened her fifth paragraph and put the dates in bold. He'd kept every name, every location, every specific piece of verifiable evidence she'd included, and he'd cut nothing that mattered. She read it twice. Then she walked back to the inn. Joe read it at the kitchen table without changing her expression. When she finished, she said, "He kept your dates in bold. He added them. I had them plain." "Right call." Joe set the paper down. "Bold dates say we are not afraid to be specific. That's different from just being specific. It's a signal to the reader and to the people named." Caleb read it standing up. He set it on the table when he finished and put one hand briefly on Winona's shoulder. 1 hand, 1 second, and then he went back out to the porch. She knew what that meant. She'd known since she was 7. The next 2 weeks brought the kind of quiet that had texture to it. A freight driver out of Bisbee mentioned that 3 papers in Ohio and Pennsylvania had run shorter versions of the piece, citing the original. A woman who came to collect laundry told Joe her cousin in St. Louis had mentioned it in a letter. An attorney from Philadelphia rode through on his way to Tucson and stopped at the inn to ask carefully, measuring the room whether anyone locally knew of a person named W. Ashworth. Joe told him she didn't. The attorney left a card on the counter with his name and firm address and, handwritten on the back in pencil, the name of the bounty operation, with a question mark after it, and a second line below. "Will testify if called." Joe brought the card to Winona. Winona added it to the box where she kept her source materials. The box now had 26 items in it. Crane saw a copy of the paper on the 16th day. A man in a saloon in Bisbee had brought it in from the stage and was reading names out loud, because they were the kind of names that made a room go quiet and lean in at the same time. Silas Crane happened to be 3 stools down. He heard his name before he'd registered what the man was reading. He held out his hand. The man gave it to him without argument. Crane read the whole thing at the bar. He didn't speak. He didn't change his expression. He finished his drink. He put the paper in his coat pocket. He laid 1 coin on the bar and walked out, and the man who'd handed it to him did not follow. Crane's rider left Bisbee on a hard horse that same night. What Winona wouldn't know until much later, not until Crane was standing in a courtroom explaining himself, was that Byron Hale had already known about the letter for 12 days before Crane saw it. Hale had a man in Tucson who monitored the Eastern press for mentions of the territory, and the name Ashworth had been flagged within 48 hours of the issue's publication. Hale had read a summary of the letter over his morning coffee in the Denver hotel, where he maintained a permanent room, and he'd been very still for a long time afterward. He was also watching something else. Crane had sent 2 letters to the War Department in the previous month requesting records on his brother's unit. The first had received a standard procedural deflection. The second was more specific. It named the engagement, the date, the location, and the commanding officer. The commanding officer's name had come from his brother's personal papers, which Crane had carried for 12 years. Both letters were now in Hale's coat pocket, intercepted through his contact in the department. Hale was a man who managed problems cleanly. He had been doing it for 25 years. He arranged, before riding south, for a man named Ridley to arrive in Dry Wells ahead of him with a specific set of instructions and a position on the north roof line of the hardware store. The attack came on a Sunday evening, late light, the kind of August heat that made the air above the road shimmer even after the sun had dropped below the roofline. Winona saw them from the second-floor window. 6 riders, Crane at the front, left shoulder high and rigid under his coat. She counted them twice. She put on her boots. Tobias was in the kitchen, doing something to the window latch, which he'd been talking about, fixing for 2 weeks. He looked at her face when she came through the door and set down the screwdriver. "How many?" he said. 6, possibly more already in position. He was off the porch and into the alley before she'd finished the sentence. Winona went to the writing desk. She had 2 drafts on the surface and a folder of source documents in the drawer, a secondary case she'd been building on a different contractor in Tucson. one she hadn't yet sent anywhere. She had all of it in her arms in under a minute. Joe was already at the cellar door. She held it open with one hand and held out the other for the papers. "I'll put them inside my dress," she said. "They won't search a woman my age twice. I'm not going down there." Joe looked at her with the specific look of a person who has run out of time for a longer argument. "The letters need you breathing. Go down and leave the door open, if it helps your feelings." She went down. She left the door open 3 inches. She stood on the 4th step from the bottom and watched the rectangle of kitchen light. The first shot came from the east side and took out the window above the sink. Glass, then boots on the front porch boards, then the door, then multiple sets of feet spreading out across the ground floor. Drawers being opened and thrown, papers hitting the floor. A chair overturned, Joe's voice, steady as stone. "Nothing here worth money. Walk out while you can." A man's voice. "Sit down and shut up." Then, a sound she would spend a long time trying not to replay. She was up the steps before she'd made the decision to move. She came through the cellar door with the obsidian shard in her right hand and her back against the frame. Scanning Joe was on the floor by the counter. She'd put herself between the man with a short club and the section of wall where the writing desk sat, which meant she'd moved toward him on purpose. She'd taken the swing low, left side. Her hands were flat on the floor, pushing herself upright. Her jaw was set with enormous effort. The man with the club turned toward Winona. He saw the shard. He saw her face. He was deciding. Caleb came through the back so fast that the door barely registered he'd used it. He was between Winona and the man before the man had finished deciding. The man looked at what was in Caleb's hand, and then at what was in Caleb's eyes, and ran. The others ran. Boots across the floor, and the front door swinging wide and horses outside, moving fast. Caleb held his position for 3 full counts. Then he moved through the room, window to window, checking each angle before he crossed to the front door and opened it 1 inch and looked and shut it. Winona was already on the floor beside Joe. Joe's breathing was thin and measured. Her eyes were open and clear, which Winona was taking as the most important fact currently available. She pressed 2 fingers against Joe's ribs. Joe inhaled sharply. "Left side," Joe said, 2 or 3. "I've had worse. You have never had worse. I have had exactly this bad." Joe looked at her directly. "The desk. I have the drafts." Joe closed her eyes. "Opened them. Good. Listen to me. They can destroy the desk. They can burn this building to the dirt. But they cannot go to Ohio and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and take back what's already sitting on 300 kitchen tables." A careful breath. "They do not understand what they cannot hold in their hands. That has always been their weakness." Jojo's hand found Winona's wrist. Her grip was still firm, despite everything. "One more thing. They cannot take your dignity. Only you can hand it over." Then she stopped talking and let Winona work. Tobias came through the back 4 minutes later. He had blood on his left sleeve surface wound. She could tell by the way he was moving. He went straight to Joe and did a fast assessment with his hands, flat against her ribs, pressing and listening. 2 ribs, lungs are clear. He looked at Winona. Medical kit. Now she put it in his hands. The street outside had gone from retreating to confused. She could hear it through the broken window. Horses that should have been leaving, but weren't, and voices running sharp against each other. Crane's voice above the others, asking something no one was answering clearly. Then one shot, single, from the north. One of Crane's riders went down in the road. Caleb was at the broken window for 4 seconds. He came back and stood in the middle of the kitchen with the deliberate stillness of a man sorting through something fast. Tobias finished the last wrap of bandage and looked up. "That shot came from north of the building." "Yes," Caleb said. "We had no one north of the building." "No." Tobias looked at the window. "Someone shot Crane's man from a position that was supposed to read as ours." Nobody said the next part out loud. Caleb moved to the back door and stood there, facing south. And the look on his face was the look of a man who has named something he was already halfway expecting. Crane was still on his horse in the street. Winona watched him from the side of the window frame. He wasn't leaving. He was looking at the roof lines, one at a time, working through the angles. His left shoulder was pulled up tight against the pane, and he was working through it, because some kinds of thinking required ignoring the body entirely. He knew where that shot had come from. He'd been calculating angles since the war, and the angle was wrong. Not wrong by a little, wrong by the full width of the street. He sat on his horse for a long time, long enough that the whole street could feel him thinking. Then he rode, and 3 of his men rode with him, and 3 stayed behind without explanation. Tobias wrote his resignation letter at Joe's table the following morning, using Winona's pen. He wrote it to the Pima County Sheriff. He stated he had a conflict of interest in an ongoing investigation and could not continue in his role in good conscience. He blotted it, sealed it, and held it in his hand for a moment. "You're sure?" Joe called from the back room, where she was conducting a long, private argument with her own inability to stand without pain. "I was sure before I sat down," Tobias said. "I just needed a proper address for it." He mailed it. He came back and fixed the latch on the front window, then the loose board on the back step. Then he sat down across from Winona and set his notebook on the table. "The 3 names in your Tucson file, the contractor's associates. Give me what you have on them." She slid the folder across. He read her notes. She read his list. Outside the window, the morning was white with heat, and Joe was calling for someone to bring her water and stop hovering, and somewhere north of Dry Wells. Silas Crane was riding with his shoulder on fire and a question in his chest that hadn't been there yesterday. A question about an angle, about a shot, about the man he'd been working for. The evening after the attack, Dry Wells went to sleep early and stayed there. No one came back. Crane's 3 riders who'd stayed behind moved south before midnight, quietly, without any of the noise that usually came with men leaving a job undone. Tobias checked the perimeter twice and reported nothing. The street was just a street again, horses at the rail, lamplight behind curtains. The ordinary quiet of a small town that had decided not to look too closely at what had happened in it. Caleb sat on Joe's back porch until past 11. Winona brought him coffee he didn't ask for. She sat in the other chair. The desert dark was thick and full of sound insects. A distant coyote. The horses shifting in the paddock out back. "Tell me," she said. He drank his coffee. She waited. One of his habits was that he needed to find the right entry point before he could talk about something that mattered. He'd circle it for a while. She'd learned not to rush that part. "I've told you pieces," he said finally. "The raid, the charges, how I moved after, but I've never told you the whole of it." "I know," she said. He looked out at the dark. The sky above the desert was enormous and clear and salted, with stars so dense they lost their individual definitions at the edges. He'd grown up in this kind of sky, and he'd never quite gotten used to it, which was one of the few things about himself he found almost admirable. 1,871, he said. Spring, southeast of the territory, near the border. There'd been reports of raiding coming down from the mountains' livestock. Some settlements hit. The army sent a detachment, 22 men. I was a scout, civilian attached, which meant I went first, and they were supposed to wait for what I found. The coffee was getting cold in his cup. "I found the camp," he said, Chiricahua. About 60 people, mostly women and old men and children. Few warriors, maybe 8 or 10. No weapons staged. No tracks going out. It was a resting camp. A winter camp they'd stayed in too long. The kind of camp you make when you're tired and trying to be still. He stopped. A long pause. "I came back and reported exactly what I found." I told Hale, Captain Byron Hale, commanding the detachment, that the camp had no staging, no evidence of raiding activity, and that going in would be going in wrong. The coyote somewhere out in the black called once and went quiet. He ordered the advance anyway. Winona kept still. She'd learned that keeping still was sometimes the only useful thing a person could do. "I went back out ahead of them," Caleb said. "I was trying to get to the camp before the horses did. Give the people a chance to scatter. Get the children out." His hand around the coffee cup had gone tight without him seeming to notice. I was maybe 100 yards ahead when the firing started. I turned back. Hale had given the order early. He paused. I don't know if he moved up deliberately or if he was just impatient. I've spent 14 years trying to figure out which one it was. I don't think it matters anymore. The massacre, Winona said. 19 people dead, mostly the ones who couldn't run fast enough. He set the cup down. I was found in the camp after, gun drawn, in the middle of the dead. Hale wrote the report. It said I'd led the charge, said it was my call to advance, said I'd fired first, and no one corrected him. 3 men in that detachment knew it was wrong. 1 died in the fighting. 1 took a transfer to New Mexico and never looked back. 1 he stopped. 1 tried to file a correction and had his service record pulled, and was told very specifically what would happen to his family if he persisted. The back screen door swung in the breeze. Once, twice I ran, Caleb said. I was dishonorably discharged for a crime I tried to prevent. And I ran. I came west. I let them bury my name under a lie because I couldn't figure out any other way to stay alive and keep your mother alive, and eventually you. His voice hadn't broken. It was still even. But it had gone the way a voice goes when a person is managing something much larger than what's showing. Your mother knew all of it, he said. She never asked me to make it right. She never asked me to go back and fight it, she said. A man who knows the truth about himself doesn't need anyone else to say it out loud. She believed that. He was quiet. I believed it when she was alive. After she died, I wasn't so sure. He put his face in his hands, not sobbing, not any of the visible kinds of grief. Just his hands over his face and his shoulders still, and the weight of 14 years, doing what 14 years do when they finally get put down somewhere. Winona sat with him. She didn't touch him yet. She'd learned that from him. Actually, the value of nearby presence before contact. After a while, she moved her chair closer and put her hand over his wrist, the way he had put his hand on her shoulder after the letter ran. Brief and sure, and meaning everything it meant, without saying any of it. He lowered his hands. He looked old tonight in a way he usually didn't. Not decrepit, just marked. 14 years marked, the way old wood gets marked by weather, and is still solid because of it, not despite it. He's here because of the letter, Caleb said, not Crane's copy. He knew before Crane. He has contacts in places Crane doesn't even know about. He came because something in what you wrote got too close to what he's been protecting. He came to stop it, Winona said. He came to make sure I can't corroborate it. Caleb picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down. A young woman writing a letter is one kind of problem. A young woman writing a letter, and her father being the surviving scout from a military massacre, is a different kind of problem, entirely. Then we need to corroborate it, Winona said. He looked at her. We need someone else who was there. On the Apache side, she paused, or someone who survived it. Something in the porch air changed. Winona, he said. I've been thinking about it since chapter 2, when you told me she might still be alive. Since then, I've been thinking about what it would mean. Not for you, for the record. She kept her voice level. The official Army report described an unprovoked attack by hostile Apache warriors against a lawful military reconnaissance. That's what's in the record. If someone who was in that camp is alive and willing to speak, that's the Apache side of the story. It's what the record erased. He was quiet for a long time. She might be at San Carlos, he said. That's where they moved the Chiricahua after the reservation consolidation. If she's alive, Lawson, your grandmother, that's where she'd be. Then we go. He picked up his cup. He drank the rest of the cold coffee. He set the cup down on the porch railing and looked at it. I failed her family, he said. I know she knows that. I've been failing to face that for 10 years. She's my grandmother, Winona said. You failed and you didn't fail, and she's been out there either way. She's been out there, and I have never met her, and I would like to meet her before I'm old. He looked at her with the quiet look that meant he was being very precisely honest. I'm afraid of what she'll say to me, I know, Winona said. That's not a good reason not to go. No, she agreed. It isn't. She went inside and came back with the obsidian shard, Willow's obsidian shard, the one she'd carried in her boot since she was 16. the one her mother had carried before her. She held it in her palm in the lamplight. It was small, maybe 3 inches, chipped and shaped by hand. The edge was still sharp. "Tell me where she got this," Winona said. Caleb looked at it for a moment. "From her mother," he said. "Who got it from hers?" The Chiricahua used obsidian for tools and ceremony. Both it was considered something that came through time, not just from the earth. When Willow gave it to you, she didn't say anything. You remember, you asked what it was, and she said, "A thing that belongs in your hand." I remember. That's as much as she said about most things that mattered. Winona turned the shard in her hand. "I want to show this to Lozen," she said, "when we go." He looked at the shard, at his daughter's hand around it, at the dark beyond the porch. He sat with that for a while. 3 days, he said. "I need to know the road is clear of Crane's men. 3 days, and then we go to San Carlos." Winona curled her fingers around the shard. That was enough. They left before dawn on the 4th day. Tobias rode with them. Nobody asked him to. He came down to the paddock at 4 in the morning, with his horse saddled, and his rifle booted, and his hat on, and he looked at Caleb, and Caleb looked at him, and they settled the question without speaking. Joe stood on the back porch watching them go, one hand on the doorframe. Her ribs wouldn't allow riding yet. She had given Winona a sealed letter 2 nights before a second copy of the documentation, addressed to a different editor, be opened and sent if something happened on the road, and she didn't come back. She hadn't explained this. Winona had simply put it in her coat. The road southeast was quiet and bone-colored in the early dark. They rode single file through the narrow parts and spread out when the land opened up. Caleb knew this country, like a man knows a wound intimately, with particular knowledge of something that has cost him. He took them by a route that stayed off the main tracks, through dry creek beds and across open flats where anyone following would be visible for half a mile in every direction. Tobias fell in beside Winona on the open stretches. He didn't talk much, which she'd noticed was a feature of him on horseback. He was one of those people who got quieter when he was moving, as if the motion took care of whatever needed releasing. Once, somewhere around mid-morning, he said, "Have you ever been to San Carlos?" "No," she said. "I grew up in the territory, but never there. My father kept us moving. I went through in '79, he said, on a freight job." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing something. The government called it a reservation. It looked like the land no one wanted, and they put the people they wanted to control there. Hot in summer and flooded in winter, and the rations arrived late and short. The Apache had been brought in from 4 or 5 different bands and just told to be one people, which is like telling 6 families who've argued for 3 generations to share one house and be grateful. Winona looked at him. "You noticed all that at 19 on a freight job." "I noticed it," he said. "I didn't do anything about it." A pause. That's been the pattern. She didn't answer that. There was nothing to say that wasn't already understood between them. Caleb slowed his horse. San Carlos appeared in the afternoon light as a flat, wide settlement of adobe and brush structures along the river, with the San Carlos Agency buildings sitting up on higher ground to the east, like they wanted to observe without being confused with what they were observing. The heat was substantial, a different quality of heat than dry wells, wetter and deeper. The river's influence. The land around the agency was overgrazed and pale. Caleb stopped his horse at the edge of the settlement. He sat there. Tobias and Winona came up on either side of him. Tobias read the agency sign over the main gate and kept his face neutral. Winona looked at the structures, the cooking fires, the children moving between them, and she looked at her father. He was looking at the far edge of the settlement, a cluster of older-style dwellings, set a little apart, traditional shapes, brush and hide, maintained with care despite the surroundings. She'd be there, he said, very quiet. A woman came out from between the buildings before they'd moved. She was maybe 70, small, compact, straight-backed. Her hair was white at the front and dark still through the rest. She wore a cotton dress and a blanket across her shoulders, despite the heat, because the kind of cold she carried wasn't the weather's doing. Her face was the kind of face that has been shaped by the full set of human experiences and hasn't been broken by any of them. She stopped 12 feet away and looked at Caleb. He got down from his horse. He stood on the ground and looked back. He didn't speak. He couldn't, for a moment. Lozen looked at him for a long time, long enough to read a great deal. Then her eyes moved to Winona. Winona's heart did something outside of her control. She got down from her horse. Lozen said something in Apache. Not long, a short sentence, the cadence of which was a question. Winona said, "I don't have much of the language." "I'm sorry. You look like your mother," Lozen said, in English. Her voice was low and even. "She had your eyes." Then something broke open in Winona's chest that she'd been holding in a sealed room for 6 years, since the last time someone had said her mother's name to her, in a way that meant they'd known her. She didn't cry. She stood very still and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a moment. Then she breathed. Lozen looked at Caleb. He had taken his hat off, which was an uncharacteristic gesture. He held it in both hands against his chest, like a man at a grave. "I should have come sooner," he said. Lozen considered this. "Yes," she said. "No embellishment. No exoneration." He nodded. "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. "Come in." She fed them dried meat and corn and something from the fire that Winona couldn't name, but ate without asking, which felt like the right choice. Tobias sat outside with the horses, understanding that the inside of the dwelling needed to be what it was going to be. He had a way of reading the geometry of situations and placing himself correctly in them. It was one of his better qualities. Lozen talked. She told the story of the camp in 1871 without drama, with the flat, specific quality of someone recounting something they have told themselves 1,000 times in order to keep it from losing its shape. She described the morning, the cold, the fire being started, the children eating, the direction the sound came from, where each person was when the shooting started. She described Caleb running into the camp ahead of the soldiers. She described what he tried to do. Caleb sat across the fire from her and looked at the ground between them. He had gone very still. He was listening to his own history, told by someone who had been inside it. "You could not have stopped it," Lozen said, to him directly. "I know you believe you could have. You have believed this for 20 years. I am telling you, you could not." She paused. "I do not say this to give you comfort. I say it because it is true. And the truth does not change based on whether it helps you or not." He looked up. "What you did do," she said, "was go in when others stayed back. You could have stayed with the soldiers and let them do what they came to do. You did not. You chose to come in." She put a piece of wood on the fire. "I saw that. I told my daughter that I saw it. That is why my daughter trusted you." The fire caught the new wood, and the light shifted. Winona understood then what her mother had never explained, but had never needed to. Her parents had not ended up together by accident or by the ordinary paths of a shared life. They had been brought together by the specific gravity of a shared catastrophe, and her mother had made an informed choice. She knew what Caleb had done and what he hadn't been able to do, and she'd chosen him anyway. That was love that came from the clearest possible seeing, not from anything obscured. She reached into her coat. She held out the obsidian shard. Lozen looked at it. Something moved across her face, not surprise, recognition, and, beneath it, a particular grief that had lived so long it had become part of the face's structure. She reached out. Her fingers hovered over it without touching it. "Willows," she said. "She gave it to me when I was 16, Winona said. "She said it belonged in my hand. It came from my mother's mother." Lozen said, "I gave it to Willow. She was supposed to give it to her daughter." She looked at Winona. She did. She let her fingers rest on it. One moment, then she folded them back into her lap. "Keep it," she said. "It knows where it is." They sat with the fire for a while. Outside, the desert was doing the specific things it did, at evening the light going gold, the shadows going long, the temperature starting its slow release. Tobias would be patient. He was built for patience in the same quiet way some people are built for speed. Winona asked the question that had been sitting in her from the beginning. "The Army's record," she said. Hale's report. It says the raid was initiated by hostile Apache warriors, unprovoked. That's what's in the official documentation. I know what it says, Lozin said. I have a letter running in the Eastern Press. It names Hale's network. There's a separate case, a public one. Potentially that touches on the massacre. If you were willing to give an account of what you saw that morning, a formal, written account, it would be the Apache side of a story that only has one side on record. Lozin looked at the fire. She looked at Caleb. She looked at Winona. History, she said, is what the victors write down and what the survivors remember. What is written gets kept in buildings and treated as the truth because it is organized and clean. What is remembered gets called story and opinion and sentiment. You are asking me to make the memory into something that looks like the written. Yes, Winona said, and you believe that will change what people accept as true. I believe it will be harder for them to pretend it doesn't exist. Winona said, I can't promise what people will do with it. I can promise it will exist. Lozin was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. The evening sounds started outside birds and distance and the river. I am 71 years old, Lozin said finally. I have been on this land since before the agency was built on it. I have watched the government change what it called us, change what it called our land, and change what it called our history, each time finding a new piece of paper to make it official. She picked up a small stick, turned it in her hands. If a piece of paper can change what is true, then perhaps a piece of paper can change it back. I will write what I saw. You will make sure it goes somewhere permanent. I will, Winona said. She meant it the way her mother had always meant things, all the way down to the floor, without any part held back. They stayed one night. Lozin gave Winona her mother's language, not a full fluency, but words. A dozen words. The word for morning, the word for fire, the word for truth, the word Willow had used when she meant, I'm not changing my mind, which was apparently a specific and well-recognized word that came up often in her family. When they rode out the next morning, Luzin stood at the edge of the settlement and watched them go. Winona turned back once. The old woman's posture was straight and still. A person who had survived everything the last 50 years had put in front of her and was not finished surviving yet. Caleb didn't look back, but his shoulders were different than they'd been on the way in. Something released rather than braced. Like a man who had been carrying a stone for so long he'd forgotten it was separate from him, and then it was set down. And the shape of his own back surprised him. Tobias rode beside Winona for an hour without speaking. Then she said, history is what victors write down and survivors remember. Yes, and you're making the memory into something written. That's the project, Winona said. He thought about that. A written record that can't be retracted, even after we're all gone. A document has roots, Winona said. Joe told me that. He nodded. They rode. The desert opened up ahead of them, wide and honest, holding everything it had ever held. The morning light came hard from the east and made the shadows absolute, and somewhere behind them, an old woman sat down to write out the first line of a story the official record had decided wasn't worth telling. The pen was a worn thing, borrowed. The paper was rough. She wrote carefully, in the specific and deliberate hand of someone who understood that words on paper are the most durable things a person can leave behind. She wrote, on the morning of March 4th, 1871, our camp was at rest. They were 2 hours south of San Carlos when Caleb pulled his horse up without explanation. Winona stopped behind him. Tobias came up on the right. The canyon ahead was a natural corridor, sandstone walls running maybe 40 feet high on both sides. The floor wide enough for 4 horses abreast, but narrow enough that anyone on the rim could cover every inch of it. She'd noted it on the way out and thought nothing of it because they'd been moving through without stopping. Now Caleb was studying the rim. East first, then west. How long have they been up there? He said, quietly. Tobias followed his line of sight. A beat. East side. Maybe an hour. We were moving slow out of the settlement. West side's newer, Caleb said. You can see the sandstone dust on the ledge from a shifted boot. She could see it now. A pale smear on the edge, that the wind hadn't touched yet. Recent, Ridley, Caleb said. She remembered the name from the night Crane's men had come, the shot from the north that Caleb had identified, before anyone said it. Hale's man, she said. Yes. Caleb turned his horse slowly, like a man adjusting his position. Nothing alarming. 2 on the east rim, 1 on the west that I can place. There'll be more at the far end. He kept his voice even and his hands easy on the reins. The canyon is the plan. They drive us in and close both ends. We're not in the canyon, Tobias said. No, we're at the mouth and we've stopped, which means they're about 30 seconds from adjusting. He glanced at Winona. Obsidian. Give me your right flank. That was their shorthand from years of riding together. It meant, stay close. Move when I move. Cover the direction I name. She checked the Winchester in her saddle scabbard. Full. A rider came around the south end of the canyon at a trot, followed by 2 more. Crane was not among them. On the east rim, a hat appeared, and then a rifle barrel. On the west, a second. Then Hale came around the north end, alone on foot. He walked with his hands visible, which was either a signal of parley or the confidence of a man who believed the positions he'd arranged made his own weapon irrelevant. His coat was dusty from the road, and his hat was pulled back. He looked like a man on a morning walk, who had ended up somewhere inconvenient, Mr. Ashworth, he said, the same composed voice from the street, in Dry Wells. Except there was no pretense of a different name now. Caleb said nothing. You know why I'm here, Hale said. He stopped about 30 feet out. I know who you are, Caleb said. Byron Hale, retired captain. The man who ordered an advance on a civilian camp, killed 19 people, and wrote my name into the report where his should have been. Hale let that land. He didn't move. You've been carrying that for 14 years, without saying a word. I'd say we arrived at an arrangement. You arranged it, Caleb said. I survived it. Those aren't the same thing. Horses shifted behind Winona. She didn't turn around because she was watching the east rim, and she heard Tobias move into a position behind and right, which told her he was watching the west. Hale's eyes moved to Winona. Something in his face ran an assessment, quick and clinical, the same look he'd given the street in Dry Wells. Your daughter wrote a letter, he said. Several, Winona said. He looked at her directly. The letter that named Crane's operation. The dates, the names. That was very specific work for a young woman. I have a good teacher, she said. Alcott printed it. 3 other papers reprinted it. There's a congressional inquiry forming. He said this without heat, as a set of facts being laid out. I'm not here to punish you for that. I'm here because you're about to do the same thing to a military record. And that record is the difference between what I am and what I did. I know what you did, Caleb said. I was there. Your word against a decorated captain's documented report, Hale said. And mine, said a voice from behind Winona. She turned. Crane came through the brush on the east side of the trail, on foot, moving stiffly. His left shoulder was wrapped under his coat in something thick. He'd come up the gully from the south, on foot, alone. His rifle was on his back. He was not pointing it at anyone in their group. Hale went very still. Crane said, I got your letters from the War Department back, the ones you intercepted. He held them up. Both folded, both opened. You've got a man in the department who's been sending you anything with my name and my brother's attached. He let the letters drop to the ground. He didn't look at them. He was looking at Hale, so I sent the same inquiries through a different name. Got different answers. Hale's composure hadn't broken, but something behind his eyes had done its arithmetic and come up short. Crane pulled a folded sheet from his inside pocket. Not letters. A page from a military investigation. Hand-copied. Neat. The kind of copying done by a person who knows the original will disappear. Engagement report. April 1871. The Scouts' original assessment stated civilian camp. No hostile activity. The commanding officer ordered the advance regardless. He looked at Hale. You sent my brother's unit into that canyon so they'd draw Apache attention away from your eastern flank. They were a distraction. My brother was bait. The canyon walls were absolutely still. You survived, Crane said. My brother didn't. and you wrote up the after-action and blamed the Apache for the engagement that killed him. His voice had the quality of iron that's been heated and cooled so many times it no longer bends. I have been hunting the wrong people for 12 years, Hale said, Silas. Don't, Crane said, flat and final. On the east rim, the rifle barrel shifted. The men up there were Hale's, and they were reading the room the way armed men read rooms, and the room had just changed on them. Tobias had the west rim in his sights. Winona had the east. Caleb watched Hale. Hale looked at all of it. He looked at Crane. He made one small motion with his right hand, a signal, and the rifles on the rims pulled back. Then he looked at Caleb. Something had gone out of his face. The composure was still there, the architecture of it, but the thing behind it had shifted. You want testimony, Hale said. I want justice, Caleb said. That's different. In 1885, for a retired captain, with a clean record and the right connections. We've got the letter running in 3 states, Winona said. We've got Lozen's written account. We've got your man Ridley, who I believe can be persuaded to talk about the shot he fired during the raid at the inn. And we have Mr. Crane, who has a copy of an intercepted letter that will tell a jury quite a lot about what you've been protecting. She paused. You're not the one with the right connections anymore. He looked at her for a long moment, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and was discovering she'd been in focus the whole time. You're very young, he said. It wasn't condescension. It was more like the recognition of a thing he hadn't accounted for. Yes, she said, that's been working in my favor. Behind them, 3 young Apache men came out of the brush on the south side, carrying rifles and saying nothing. They'd come from the settlement. Lozen had known before they'd ridden out. She had sent them without telling anyone she was going to, the way a woman who has been looking after her people for 50 years sends help quietly, in advance, before the need declares itself. One of the young men looked at Hale's position on the men with the rifle barrels. He said something in Apache to the other 2. They spread out. Hale put his hands up. It was not a large gesture. It was the small, clean movement of a man who has looked at a board and understood that he has no remaining move. I'll come quietly, he said to Caleb. I'll need that to mean something at trial. Caleb crossed the distance between them. He held out his hand. Gun, he said. Hale gave it to him. Crane came forward and handed the copied investigation page to Tobias, who took it with both hands like it was a document to be handled carefully, because it was. Crane looked at the ground for a moment. He had the hollowed-out look of a man who has just learned that the thing he spent a decade being had a false foundation. All that anger, all those years. 12 years, he said. It wasn't directed at anyone. Nobody answered, because there was nothing to say that would make 12 years into anything other than what they were. Tobias put the page in his coat. He looked at the young Apache men and nodded once the specific nod of a man who recognizes that what just happened required exactly the people who were here. One of the young men nodded back. They started north. Hale walked between Caleb and Crane. Crane didn't look at him. He looked at the ground, at the trail, at the canyon walls they passed through. On the way out the canyon, that would have been a trap, except the trap had opened from the inside. Winona rode behind them all. She watched Hale's back, straight and composed even now. And she understood something her mother had told her once, around a fire when Winona was 12, about the men who built systems of harm. Your mother had said, the worst ones don't believe they're the worst ones. They have a story that makes them the reasonable party. Your job is not to convince them otherwise. Your job is to make sure the record disagrees with their story. The record was going to disagree with Byron Hale's story. She had made sure of that. She put a hand in her coat pocket and felt the obsidian shard through the lining. She rode. Getting Byron Hale into custody was the easy part. Tobias had the paperwork on it within 48 hours, Pima County, pending federal referral, with a military court petition attached because the core charge touched on wartime conduct. He wrote the arrest report in the same careful, specific language Winona had taught him. Almost without realizing, she'd taught it to him. Dates fully written out, positions named, evidence itemized in the order it had been obtained. He filed it with 3 copies, which was his own idea. If one got lost, which had been known to happen to inconvenient documents, 2 would remain. Then they waited. A military court trying a retired officer on the testimony of a mixed-blood woman and an unregistered former scout was not a thing the Army convened on a Tuesday with enthusiasm. The first response from the regional military authority was a letter requesting formal documentation of the original engagement, which Tobias answered by citing the copied investigation page Crane had provided. The second response requested proof of provenance on said page, which Tobias answered by submitting a sworn deposition from Crane himself, notarized in Tucson. The third response was silence. 3 weeks of it. They're hoping we get tired, Joe said. She was up and moving again, still careful on the left side, but upright and impatient, which was her natural state. She was reading Tobias's correspondence file at the kitchen table. We're not going to get tired, Winona said. They don't know that yet. Joe put the letters down. This is what always happens at this stage. They do not move until they believe the cost of not moving is greater than the cost of moving. Right now they think this will dissipate. They're waiting for us to lose our evidence, or each other, or our nerve. What changes the calculation? Tobias said. Public pressure, Joe said. The same thing that changed Alcott's editorial calculation when Winona's letter came in. A single case they can ignore. A case with a public already watching it is a different proposition. Winona was already writing. The second letter to Raymond Alcott was a different kind of document. The first had been testimony evidence-based, specific the bones of a case. This one was the case with meat on it. It named Hale by his full name and rank. It described the 1,871 massacre with the specific detail of 2 witnesses, both named, both with signed and dated accounts: Caleb Ashworth, surviving scout, and Lozen, a Chiricahua woman who had been in the camp that morning, and whose statement had arrived by stage from San Carlos in an envelope that smelled faintly of wood smoke. It described the intercepted War Department correspondence. It described the attempted murder by proxy at the canyon, and it included, in the final section, the names of the 3 Ohio and Pennsylvania papers that had reprinted the first letter, along with the name of the Philadelphia attorney who had left a card on Joe's counter 2 months ago, and whose firm, Winona noted, had formally offered to assist with any legal proceedings. She sent it on the first Thursday stage. She watched Hector stamp it. She went back to the inn and said nothing about it, because she'd learned that the time between sending and hearing back was the time to do other things, rather than wait. Hale was being held at the county jail in Tucson. He had a lawyer from Denver, good one, expensive, the kind of man whose suit communicated before he opened his mouth. He filed 2 motions in the first week, both aimed at the jurisdiction question. The case was county, federal, and military simultaneously, which meant 3 different authorities with 3 different interests, and no natural mechanism for making them move together. Crane was being held separately. He'd waived the right to a lawyer, and then changed his mind and waived it again, which told Winona he was still working through the basic facts of his situation. She wasn't sure how to think about Crane yet. He was not a good man. She knew what he'd done to people, what he'd organized and profited from for a decade. The fact that he'd been operating on a foundation of lies didn't make the harm he'd caused real, but he had turned. He had provided evidence at real cost to himself. That was worth something, even if she wasn't ready to say what. Tobias visited Crane in the second week. He didn't tell her he was going. He told her afterward. He talked for 2 hours, Tobias said. He was at the kitchen table with his hat off and his notes in front of him. Every contractor he worked with. Every operation he knew about. 3 names I didn't have. Delivery routes. The location of the ledger from the Bisbee contractor. He paused. He knew things about that operation I couldn't have pulled out of him with a court order. Why is he talking? Winona said. Because he's been holding it for 12 years, and the thing he built it on is gone. Tobias looked at the notes. He told me that the man who broke horses for him the year he started the operation had warned him that hating a whole people for one man's decision was going to make him do wrong things. He was quiet. He said he'd fired the man. He said he thinks about him now. Winona looked at the table. That doesn't change what he did, she said. Tobias said. It doesn't. But it matters, she said. That he understands it. Yes, he said. I think it does. They sat there with the files between them and the afternoon heat, pressing against the closed shutters. The second letter ran in the Liberty Standard, on page 2 again, in the same bold headline format Alcott used when he was angry and certain. Within 10 days, reprints appeared in 6 papers, including one in Washington. A senator from Massachusetts read a summary of the case into the congressional record as a pending matter of military accountability, which was not a legal action, but was a very public statement that someone with a platform was watching. The military court convened a formal hearing 4 days after the Massachusetts senator spoke. There was a confrontation before it started. The Army's legal representative, a major from the Tucson garrison, came to meet with Caleb 2 days before the hearing and explained, in the measured language of official bureaucracy, that the Army preferred a closed proceeding with limited testimony and a disposition focused on the most recent charges, rather than the 71 engagement. Caleb listened to the whole thing. He sat in Joe's kitchen and let the major finish. Then he said, "My daughter sent a letter to a senator." The senator read it into the record. There are now 6 papers in 4 states running this case on their front pages. Tell me what a closed proceeding does to the Army's reputation in that environment. The major looked at him. He looked at Tobias's notes on the table. He looked at the closed door. He left. The hearing was open. Witnesses were called in order. Caleb's testimony ran 4 hours across 2 days. He was specific and sequential, and he answered every question the defense lawyer put to him with the same steady attention he'd brought to 14 years of carrying the thing alone. Lozen's written account was entered into the record and read aloud by a court clerk. The clerk's voice was flat and procedural, but the room was not flat when he read it. Some things resist the official voice. Crane took the stand on the 3rd day. He was gaunt and composed, and he told the truth in the specific, orderly way of a man who had decided that the only thing he had left to give was accuracy. The Denver lawyer objected 17 times. 7 objections were sustained. Crane answered the other questions. On the 4th day, Winona was called. She walked to the stand in the same dress she'd worn to mail the first letter. Joe had pressed it that morning without being asked. Tobias had stood at the door of the inn and watched her walk across the street and had not offered to accompany her because he understood that this particular walk needed to be hers alone. She was sworn in. She sat down. The prosecuting attorney asked her to state what she had personally witnessed. She described May 3rd in Bisbee, the date, the time, the specific positions of each person, the wagon, the contractor's bill of sale, the brand on the tackle. She described what she had heard Crane's man say in Dry Wells. The specific words, "the captain wants," this one quiet, and the date and context in which she'd heard them. She described the attempt on the canyon. She described everything with the precision Joe had spent 2 years teaching her. Evidence first. Conclusions earned, not assumed. Facts the court could verify, labeled as such, separate from what she interpreted, labeled as that. The Denver lawyer cross-examined her for 90 minutes. He was skilled. He found 2 minor inconsistencies in chronology and made what he could of them. She corrected both inconsistencies herself, cleanly, explaining the source of the discrepancy each time. She did not get flustered. She did not perform. She simply knew what she had seen and why she knew it, and was prepared to explain both. When the cross-examination was done, the prosecuting attorney stood. "One final question," he said. "Miss Ashworth, you wrote in your published correspondence that, and I am summarizing, what can be put on paper cannot be erased. Do you still believe that?" "I believe," she said, "that once something is part of the record, it requires effort to ignore. The people who want it ignored have to keep working. The record just sits there." She looked at the court. "That seems like a reasonable advantage to me." The verdict came on a Thursday morning. Byron Hale was convicted on 3 counts falsification of military engagement records, conduct unbecoming an officer, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. The military court added a civilian referral on the trafficking-related charges, which would be tried separately in federal court. Winona was sitting on Joe's front porch when Tobias came across the street with the document. He put it in her hands without speaking, because some things don't need words placed in front of them. She read it once, all the way through. Then she set it on the porch rail and looked at the street. It was a Thursday morning in Dry Wells, the same way any Thursday morning was horses at the rail, the hardware store open, a dog asleep in the shade of the barber shop steps, the bread smell from the south side of town, Hector behind his counter at the depot, doing what Hector did. She looked at the spot in the middle of the street where Crane's men had walked her through in August. She remembered finishing the last 4 words of the letter with the rope on her wrists, the way the pencil had felt between her ring finger and her pinky, the specific August heat on the back of her neck. "What happens to Crane?" she said. Tobias sat down on the step below the porch rail. Reduced sentence. Federal plea. He agreed to testify in the trafficking cases. There are 4 more, in 3 territories. He'll serve 2 years and spend the next 5 in a supervised capacity, working with the Indian Rights Association. His idea, not theirs. A pause. He asked specifically to work with mixed-blood families. She considered that. "Can a man undo 12 years?" she said. "No," Tobias said. "I think he knows that." He looked at the street. "But maybe he can use the next 12 for something that matters." Joe came through the front door with 2 cups of coffee. She handed them down and settled into her chair. She read the verdict document from where it sat on the rail, top to bottom, and handed it back to Winona. "Good," she said. That was all. But Joe's good was a complete sentence. Caleb was already in the paddock when Winona went around back. She'd known he would be. It was his habit after any significant event motion. Horses, the specific quiet of animal company. He had the gray mare on a long line and was walking her in slow circles. She leaned on the paddock fence and watched. After a while, he stopped the mare and came over. He leaned on the fence from the inside and looked at the verdict document she held out. He read it. He folded it and gave it back. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "No," he shook his head. "Once I fired a gun and kept us alive. You put it in the record. Those are different jobs. Both necessary. Yours is the one that lasts." She folded the document and put it in her coat pocket. She took out the obsidian shard. She'd been carrying it every day since San Carlos, the same as always. Except she'd been thinking about what Lozen had said, "It knows where it is," and she'd been deciding something. "I want to take it back to her," Winona said. Caleb looked at the shard. "She gave it to your mother. Your mother gave it to you." He paused. "The circle's your call. She should have it," Winona said. "It started with her family. She's the last one left from that generation. She should hold it while she can." She wrapped it back in the leather and put it in her coat. Caleb took the mare off the line and walked her to the rail. He ran his hand along the horse's neck, the same easy motion he'd used his whole life. Without thought, just contact. He looked at the mountains east of town, which were the same mountains they'd always been, indifferent and enormous, and carrying everything beneath them without complaint. "I want to go back to San Carlos before winter," he said. "Properly this time. Stay a few days. Bring her what she needs." "She needs flour and decent medicine," Winona said, "and she'd like very much to argue with you about 1,871. "I know," he almost smiled. "I think I owe her that." 3 weeks later, the editor at the Liberty Standard published a follow-up piece. It was longer than the original, and it named not just the trafficking ring, but the military conspiracy that had given it cover. It ran a summary of the court verdict and a short profile of the 2 primary witnesses. Raymond Alcott had written the editorial himself this time, not in anger, but in something quieter. The last line was about the persistence of documented truth. Joe read it at the kitchen table and underlined that line with a pencil. A copy arrived, as they always did, between 2 books in a package from Cincinnati. Joe nailed it to the wall above the writing desk. Tobias had taken a new position with the Indian Rights Association, filing claims on behalf of families who'd lost property and relatives under the bounty systems. He rode out of town 3 days a week and came back with notes and case files, and the particular tiredness of someone doing the kind of work that generates more of itself the further in you get. He ate dinner at Joe's table most evenings. He fixed the 3 things that were broken and the 4 things that had been broken so long everyone had stopped seeing them. He had a bunk in the room off the stable, which was a practical arrangement that nobody examined closely. He and Winona fell into the habit of the evening porch. After dinner, after the files, 2 chairs, and the cooling air, and whatever conversation happened to be there. Sometimes there was a lot of it. Sometimes there was almost none, which suited both of them equally well. One evening in October, when the temperature had finally broken and the desert air had the first edge of autumn in it, he said, "I've been thinking about the woman from the wagon. 1,874. The one who looked at me." Winona said nothing. She waited. "I found her," he said. "She's at the Mescalero agency with her daughters. They're alive." A pause. "I wrote her a letter. I told her who I was, what I saw and what I didn't do." He was looking at the street. She wrote back. She said she remembered the boy at the corner. "What else did she say?" Winona asked. "She said you were a child." Children are not responsible for the failures of the world they're born into, but they grow up. What they do then is theirs. He stopped. Then she asked if I could help her file a land return claim on a piece of ground that had been wrongly taken. So I did. Winona looked at him. "You're going to carry that for a while anyway," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." "That's right," she said. "You should carry it. Just don't let it make you useless." He turned to look at her. "That's very direct. I learned from the best." He reached across the space between the chairs, and his hand covered hers on the armrest. Warm and still. She turned her hand over and held his. The street in front of them went on being the street, the last of the evening light on the false front buildings. A lamp coming on behind a curtain. A man somewhere playing a harmonica badly and without shame. November brought a rider from Lozen's son's family, with a letter confirming what Caleb had hoped. Lozen was well, working with the agency doctor on a trachoma outbreak that had come into the settlement with the autumn. And yes, she would receive visitors before winter. She'd sent a short message for Winona specifically. It was 3 lines, written in the same careful hand as the account she'd given Winona in October. The shard arrived safely. "I am wearing it. History requires people who know what they saw. You know what you saw. Keep writing." Winona read it twice. She folded it and put it in the box with the source materials, with the attorney's card, with the copy of the first verdict document, with the newspaper clippings from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and one from a paper in Chicago that Joe had found tucked in a Methodist magazine donated to the inn. The box was getting heavy. She'd need a second one soon. The gathering was Joe's idea. A Sunday afternoon, last week of November. The front room of the inn opened up, and the chairs pushed back, and whoever wanted to come could come. Joe made food. Tobias hammered a notice to the post at the depot and the barber shop without explaining exactly what it was for, just the time and place, and the name of Joe Freeman's inn. More people came than Winona expected. She stood at the front of the room with the document box on a table beside her, and Caleb 3 steps back and to the left, and Tobias at the door, and Joe visible through the kitchen archway, making sure there was enough coffee. She read. She read from the original letter, the one she'd finished on a scrap of paper with her hands bound, mailed on a Thursday morning for 12 cents. She read slowly, the way Joe had taught her evidence first. Conclusions earned. The truth given space to stand on its own before anyone was asked to believe it. She read the specific dates and the specific names and the account of May 3rd in Bisbee. She read Lozen's 3 paragraphs about the morning in 1,871. She read the verdict document. The room listened. The room that had watched her, dragged through the street in August, was listening to her read to it in November. Some of the same faces were in there. The barber, the woman who had pulled her child back from the steps. Nobody looked away. When she finished, she put the pages down and looked at the room and said, "A written record is not the end of a fight. It's the evidence that the fight happened and what it was about. What you do with the evidence is yours to decide." She looked at the spot through the window where the street ran past. She had stood in that street. In a way, she would not be standing in it again. The rope was gone. The letter was in 100 cities. Her grandmother had the obsidian shard around her neck on the Mescalero land and was treating a trachoma outbreak with the same steady competence she'd brought to 50 years of everything else. Her father was alive. He had a name now, his own name, used in a courtroom and put in a newspaper and said aloud in a room full of people. Caleb Ashworth, the man who'd gone in when others hadn't, the man who'd stayed alive long enough for the truth to catch up with what he'd done. Winona put the pages in the box. She closed the lid. The room began to break up into conversation, the way rooms do, after something significant, people finding each other, talking quietly, some of them already working through what they'd heard and what they thought it meant. Joe came out of the kitchen with coffee and moved through the room and talked to everyone. Because Joe Freeman had been talking to everyone in this town for 11 years and was not going to stop on account of a Sunday afternoon. Tobias came away from the door and found Winona at the edge of the room and stood next to her, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the people. His coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. "Good room," he said. "Good town," she said. "When it decides to be." She picked up the box. Caleb lived out his remaining years in Dry Wells. He didn't move on, which had been his pattern for over a decade, one town after the next. He stopped. He stayed. He had a room at the inn for 2 years, and then a small adobe house at the south end of town, where he kept 2 horses and a kitchen garden that produced more squash than one man could reasonably manage. And he gave the rest away without being asked. He rode to San Carlos twice a year, stayed a week each time. He and Lozen argued about 1,871 with the specific, productive honesty of 2 people who had been in the same event and remembered it differently, and who had gotten old enough to understand that both memories could be true simultaneously. He learned 20 words of Apache, not enough to be useful, enough for her to know he'd tried. He taught his granddaughter to shoot when she was 7, against his better judgment and at her insistence, and she hit the bottle on the 3rd try. He sat on the porch when the evenings were good and looked at the mountains and did not seem to be looking for anything anymore, just looking, like a man who had put something down and found that his hands, free of the weight, didn't know what else to do, so they were learning to rest. It was enough. It was in the end more than enough. The story you have just witnessed is not only about the American frontier, nor is it simply about gunfights, justice, or survival. At its heart, it is about something far more enduring, the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to let the truth disappear. Winona Ashworth never possessed the wealth of powerful businessmen, the political influence of military officers, or the firepower of ruthless outlaws. What she carried instead was a pencil, a handful of carefully written letters, and the unwavering belief that truth deserves a permanent place in history. In a world where lies were stamped with official seals and injustice hid behind legal documents, she discovered that words, when written with honesty and supported by evidence, could become stronger than bullets. Guns may win a battle, but truth has the power to outlive generations. Caleb Ashworth reminds us that even the strongest people carry invisible burdens. For years, he lived beneath the crushing weight of guilt, convinced that one terrible tragedy defined the rest of his life. Yet healing did not begin when others forgave him. It began when he found the courage to face the past instead of running from it. His journey teaches us that redemption is never about pretending mistakes never happened. It is about accepting responsibility where it belongs, telling the truth even when it costs everything, and choosing to spend the rest of your life building something better than the life you left behind. Joe Freeman represents another kind of hero rarely celebrated in history books. She never wore a badge, carried a famous name, or stood at the center of a battlefield. Instead, she quietly protected others, preserved evidence, taught the discipline of honest writing, and reminded those around her that integrity is built one small decision at a time. She shows us that societies are not only saved by extraordinary heroes. More often, they are preserved by ordinary people who simply refuse to look away when injustice stands before them. The transformation of Tobias Wren offers another powerful lesson. As a young man, he witnessed suffering and convinced himself there was nothing he could do. Many of us have experienced moments like that, times when fear, uncertainty, or youth kept us silent. But Tobias proves that while we cannot rewrite yesterday, we can always decide who we will become tomorrow. Regret only becomes meaningful when it inspires action. The past may explain our failures, but it should never imprison our future. Perhaps the greatest surprise of the story comes through Silas Crane. He committed terrible wrongs, and nothing can erase the pain those actions caused. Yet, when the foundation of his hatred collapsed, he chose to stop protecting the lie that had shaped his life. His decision reminds us that justice is not built upon revenge alone. Real justice demands accountability, confession, and the willingness to repair what can still be repaired. Some wounds never disappear, but every person still has the choice to leave the world better than they found it. This story also reminds us that history is never as simple as the official record suggests. Too often, those with power write the first version of events, while the voices of ordinary people are forgotten. But forgotten does not mean false. Every generation has a responsibility to ask difficult questions, to listen to those who were never given a chance to speak, and to understand that truth often survives in the memories of ordinary families long before it reaches the pages of history books. One of the most unforgettable ideas in this story is that a document has roots. Rumors fade. Lies evolve. Fear changes shape. But carefully documented truth becomes something future generations can return to. It becomes evidence. It becomes memory. It becomes history. Whether you are writing a journal, preserving family stories, exposing corruption, or simply telling the truth when it would be easier to remain silent, your words may become the foundation upon which someone else finds justice years or even decades later. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.